Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope you've all had a fantastic day as we've continued to meet as a church virtually. It's also been great to hear about some people who've been joining us remotely during lockdown. And we look forward to meeting you in person once we're together again under one roof. As you may be aware, we are currently working our way through the book of Job in house groups, and this has got me thinking about some things that we rarely find ourselves considering. In the first couple of chapters of Job, we twice find ourselves in the presence of God and hear exchanges between him and the devil. It's got me thinking about occasions in the Bible where we hear about people finding themselves in God's presence and what the Bible tells us about how Satan operates. Heavy stuff for a brief thought on a Sunday evening, I know, but let's get started. To explore this in a bit more detail, we're going to start by reading the first 6 verses of Zechariah 3. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. And the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And to him he said, "Behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." And I said, "Let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments, and the angel of the Lord was standing by. Aside from the 4 Gospels, which record the life of Jesus on earth, there aren't many occasions in the Bible where we get a glimpse into heaven, or where people have a vision or encounter with God himself. But every time we do, the response of the individual involved is the same. In Isaiah 6, we read of how Isaiah finds himself in the presence of God, and in verse 5 he cries out, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." The day is coming when every human being will find themselves in the presence of God, and no matter how they've reacted to God in this life, their response on that day will be precisely the same as Isaiah. As we look on the glory of God, our sinfulness will be all too evident to us, and everyone will find themselves bowing before him, just as Ezekiel does in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 28, and the Apostle John in Revelation chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. Moving back to Zechariah 3, we also see how Satan seeks to actively accuse Joshua the high priest before God. If ever we think that Satan is passively letting people, whether they are Christians or not, go about their lives, this verse reminds us that is definitely not the case. In order to prove this, I'd like to cite a few examples from the Old and New Testaments. In Genesis 3, Satan cunningly deceives Eve into breaking the one command God gave her and Adam. As we've seen in our study of Job, he can actively attack people's health, incite others to inflict harm, and bring about natural disasters. In the New Testament, he tries to tempt Jesus into sinning against God the Father, and in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 3 and 4, we read, "And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the eyes of the unbelievers, to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." It is clear from these examples that Satan is constantly at work in the world in which we live, and is determined to draw people into sin, blind them to the existence of God, and the salvation which he offers. Finally, we come to Joshua the high priest. He is wearing filthy clothes, and the individual Satan is preparing to accuse. As the narrative moves on, it is clear that the dirt on his clothing is linked to his iniquity or sin. Satan seems determined to highlight the guilty of Joshua before God, but he isn't even given the opportunity to open his mouth, because God, knowing the heart of Satan, immediately rebukes him. As we've learned in our study of Job, so far Satan does not have limitless power, and God quite definitely in sovereign control over everything and everyone. God's rebuke of Satan is final here, and there's no response or reaction from Satan. God then proceeds to take action to remove Joshua's filthy clothing and replace it with clothing that is pure. In doing this, he's taking away Joshua's sin and replacing it with righteousness. This is the transformation that takes place in the life of everyone who trusts in Jesus for their salvation. And the point to note here is that this transformation is not one that Joshua takes responsibility for himself, but rather it is God that says, "Remove the filthy garments from him, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." For everyone who is a Christian, this is a remarkable truth to be reminded of. We cannot stand before God relying on our own goodness, and we are unable to refute the accusations of Satan that we are guilty of breaking all of God's laws. But God himself has removed our sin and does not permit Satan to point out our sinfulness. This is also tremendous news for anyone who isn't a Christian, because it demonstrates how God deals with the sin of anyone who says sorry to him for the sins they've committed and place their faith in Jesus' death and resurrection for his forgiveness. There is an old hymn which sums this up in 2 short phrases, which has been going through my head this week. Who is a pardoning God like thee, or who has grace so rich and free?